Well, this morning we are going to be talking about the faith of Abraham, or I guess I should say we're going to start talking about the faith of Abraham. The other ones we have talked about so far, their stories have been for the most part shorter. Maybe not so much Noah, but certainly Enoch and Abel. We're just given a handful of verses. But when we start talking about Abraham, we're talking about someone that there's a lot more to tell about his life. And like Noah, of course, he's one of the most well-known men of history, of biblical history. Of course, we think of him ourselves as the father of the nation of Israel, and he was. But you also got to remember he's also considered the father of 3 religions, not only of Israel, but of Christianity and of Islam. He's considered the father of Islam as well. So he's really the central figure of arguably most of the world's religions.
Yeah.
So he's pretty important. And of course, to the readers of Hebrews, obviously, them being Jewish Christians, he's central to them, to their identity, their ethnic and religious identity as well, as their example. And they can still consider, obviously, him, Father Abraham. And of course, he was, as we talked about in detail, when we talked about the covenants, he, of course, was the one who received the first major covenant, that we call the Abrahamic covenant, obviously based on his name, that gave birth essentially to the whole nation of Israel and to God's relationship with Israel and ultimately with us through the new covenant. But also, in the same way that like we talked about with Noah, that you think of him as a great man because of how obedient he was to God. And that was something we focused on a lot. With Noah was how obedient he was, but how was important was that Noah's obedience was a manifestation of the fact that he believed what God told him. His obedience wasn't based on any legalistic saying that I have to be good and I have to obey laws and regulations and that sort of thing. It's just that God told him something, he considered God trustworthy, and he believed God. And because he believed God, that led to his obedience. Well, Abraham is essentially for different reasons obviously, but a similar story. There are many areas in his life where we could point to and talk about Abraham's obedience to God. However, as we're going to see, the nature of the author of Hebrews' argument is, like Noah, this was an outgrowth of and a manifestation of his faith, that he believed God. Now, my pattern here, as we see the by faith, verse in Hebrews, is then to go and to look at that person's life in the Old Testament to see exactly how their life demonstrated that faith that's mentioned in Hebrews 11. And we're going to do that with Abraham, of course, but there is no way that we could reasonably go through Abraham's entire life. He's mentioned in the beginning in Genesis 11, and his story goes all the way through like Genesis chapter 26. And it also intertwines with a lot of other personalities and stories in the book of Genesis as well. If we went into a detail, this is the life of Abraham, that could be a 6-month study by itself. And like you were suggesting last week or the week before, that's something we may in fact do when we're through with Hebrews. But what I want to do today is I want to touch on 3 specific events or areas in Abraham's life, because they are the 3 areas that are mentioned in Hebrews 11 as being examples of where Abraham believed God. So we're going to just touch on those 3 main areas and not go into the details of everything else that went on. But one thing that I think is fair to say, and I think we should keep in the back of our mind, is that while the book of Hebrews certainly presents Abraham as a man of faith, and ultimately he definitely did believe God, if you examine his life in detail, you will see that his faith was not always perfect. His faith was definitely a work in progress during his life. And I think Abraham is really a good example for overall the Christian life, as you see that he was imperfect in his obedience to God and his faith in God. There were times he, frankly, didn't quite believe what God was telling him. And there are times he made bad decisions. And he was a man whose faith grew. He wasn't the same man at the end that he was at the beginning. So, and I think that's interesting that the author of Hebrews nonetheless presents him as a man of faith and as a hero of the faith. But he was still human, and he was still fallible, and he still had fears and doubts and uncertainties. And to me, that's encouraging to me as a Christian, because it reminds me that I can still be called a man of faith if ultimately I believe God, even if I didn't always do it perfectly, even if I struggled at times, even if I made the wrong decisions at times, even if I said I believed God but acted like I didn't. That's my thing a lot of times, is to say, yeah, of course I have faith in God, I believe God, but then in your actions it's like you don't really believe Him, or you wouldn't have done that, you know. And sometimes Abraham was like that too, and sometimes we have to remember that these heroes of our faith were just ordinary men and women just like us, and they have the same struggles and fears and doubts and makes mistakes just like we do. I think what's important is the journey and the fact that there's evidence that we grow. And I've said this about my own life. There are things that God allowed me to face in my later life that would have probably utterly destroyed me if they had happened to me when I was, say, in my 20s and a baby Christian. And God knows that. And I think that's part of why the Bible says that He never gives you more than you can handle. Because I think our faith, like a muscle, has to grow. It has to strengthen. And like a muscle, it grows from use. And the more you use it, the stronger it gets. I think that's true of faith as well. And God, I can trust God and believe God now because He's never let me down. He's always been there for me. He's always kept His promises, and He's never abandoned me. He's never failed me. So I know He's proven Himself trustworthy. Not that He has to, but He has. I think that's the same pattern we see with Abraham's life. He asks of Abraham a certain level of faith that is at the point he is at in his life. He doesn't ask more of him than he can handle. But as we see, as his faith grows, then God asks more of him. And ultimately, he did believe God. So we're going to focus on these three areas where the author of Hebrews says he did believe God. And I'm not going to spend too much time on the failures, other than just and we'll talk about those more when we do get to that point that we decide to go through the life of Abraham. But just keep that in the back of your mind, that we're not saying he was perfect. He was a work in progress just like we are, and his faith grew throughout his life. So anyway, getting back to the point, talking about Abraham, who then was Abraham? Well, he's introduced to us in Genesis chapter 11, beginning in verse 26, when it talks about his father, Terah. Terah had lived 70 years, became the father of, at this point, of course, as you know, his name was actually Abram originally. Mentions his two brothers, Nahor and Haran. So the last half of Genesis 11 is very similar to Genesis 5, in that it's essentially a genealogy, tracing the line of descendants from Noah, who we focused on before, through his son Shem, through many generations after the flood, down to Terah, the father of three sons, one of whom was Abram at this point. And his name originally in the form Abram means high father, is what that meant. So we go on and we see in verses 29 and 30, Abram and Nahor both married, and the name of Abram's wife was Sarai. Now Sarai was barren, she had no children. Now, this is interesting, talking about the meaning of her name, her original name. The root of her name, Sar, means a chief or captain. And so her name actually means someone who gives orders, someone who dominates or who's in charge. So her name essentially means bossy. I have no idea if that matched her personality, I don't know, but that's what her name meant. But because she was, I think this is, again, this is Chuck's speculation, reading between the lines. At this point, of course, in history, marriage was not always done because of love. Oftentimes, marriage was done for other reasons, sometimes political reasons, sometimes just because you need to get married and have sons to perpetuate your name, to have a big family, to have people that can, till the fields and, and all that kind of thing. And so it implies that Sarah knew early on that she could not have children. Yet Abram still married her. And so Abram couldn't have married her just to have children. And I only say that to say, to me, that says that there was a real love there. There was a real bond of friendship and love there between Abram and Sarai. And I just think that's significant because at this time culturally, that was not always what was most important when it came to marriage. You married because you had to get married. You married for family reasons. You married for, lots of other practical reasons, not always love. I get the sense that that wasn't the case here, that they really did love each other and really had a bond and a friendship. Again, I can only speculate. It doesn't say it in so many words. I'm just assuming that based on the fact that it was clear from the beginning that she was barren. So, well, probably didn't know before they were married, but he could have put her away once they found out that she couldn't have children. And he didn't. He stayed with her. And I think that says a lot for their relationship and his character. So, what happens with Abraham? What is it that sets Abraham on his spiritual journey, which eventually ends up in Hebrews chapter 11 as a hero of the faith? Well, essentially, Abraham is given 3 promises of God that we're going to focus on, and orders, essentially, by God, that show up in Genesis chapter 12, and Genesis chapter 17, and Genesis chapter 22. This is the 3 places where these directions by God, these calls of God, come from. So the first one you're familiar with, obviously we talked about it when we were going through the covenants. Genesis chapter 12:1. The Lord said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land that I will show you." So what we had seen at the end of chapter 11, Abram had settled with his family, not just Sarah, but also his nephew Lot, son of his brother Haran, who had died earlier. He had sort of taking care of his nephew because Haran had died earlier. And they were in this place also called Haran. I don't know if it was named after the brother, I don't know, it doesn't say, but they were living in a place called Haran as well. And they'd settled there, and they'd made their life there. And up to this point, there was no particular indication of a unique or peculiar relationship that Abram had with God. Certainly nothing he had done nothing to cause any particular notice of God. Yet, God sovereignly chose Abram and picked him out of everyone he could have picked. He picked Abram out of all the other men of the earth to go on this great journey. Both a physical, literal journey, telling him to go to a country, and also, of course, a spiritual journey, because in the context of his call to go to Canaan, he also gave him this covenant. So essentially, he called Abram to give up his settled life, everything that he had ever known, and take off and go to this place he'd never been and had no ties to. It's not like he was saying go and move to this, go back to Ur where he was from originally. He was telling him to go to this place he'd never been to before and knew nothing about. So the only thing that Abram would have to go on was God's direction and leading, because he specifically said to go to this land that I will show you. Now, in verses 2 to 4, this is where he gives him the covenant, I will make of you a great nation. So it was based on this initial command to leave where he was in Haran that God revealed to Abram the great promise of that covenant, not based on anything that Abram had done up to that point in his life. Because remember, we talked about that when we discussed the Abrahamic covenant, that it wasn't God responding to this man who, it doesn't say like he did with Noah or Enoch that Abram walked with God. There was no indication other than just mentioning his name that he picked him out for this. It doesn't seem to be anything that Abram had done to earn or warrant God's special attention. He simply picked him out and said that this was what he was going to do, sovereignly and without condition. He was going to make this covenant with him, things that God would do in his life, and not just his life, but the life of all of his descendants. And so he was promising that Abram would become this great nation. And that leads to the second main promise of God. So God also said to Abraham, this is the second promise, and this takes us into, and I know we're skipping a bit, but we're just focusing on what he promised that he was going to do. This is related, of course, to the Abrahamic covenant. In order to make of him a great nation, he was going to have descendants. Well, we've already focused on the fact that Sarah was barren. So, in Genesis chapter 17, in verses 15 to 16, God also said to Abraham, as for Sarah your wife, you are no longer to call her Sarai, her name will now be Sarah. I will bless her and will surely give you a son by her. Now by this time, this happened earlier in chapter 17, God had already changed Abram's name to Abraham. And that version just means father of a multitude. So that kind of goes along with his promise that he's going to make him a great nation. He changed his name from just a high father to father of a multitude. Now, to go along with that, he also gives Sarai a new name, Sarah. So what does that mean? Well, Sarah simply means a lady, as in a noble person, not lady like just female, but like Lady Sarah, It means a noble person, a princess, or even a queen. So he really elevates the meaning of her name to being a great noble lady. But specifically, he promises that the descendants that he's mentioned several times, because he'd said before that you're going to have descendants as great as the stars of the sky. So in those intervening chapters, he had already made that promise. He was saying that his descendants was going to come from he and Sarah's son, as opposed to Ishmael, who, of course, as you know, we've skipped over that part, but Ishmael, which was the son of Abraham and Hagar, who was Sarah's Egyptian maidservant. That happened back in chapter 16. And this gets to the point that I alluded to before, and we won't focus here, but Abraham was at the point where he thought he had to help God out, because God had said, you're going to be the father of many nations, but they were already old, both of them. By this time, Abraham was 99 and Sarah was 90, and he just said, I'm going to have to do something to help God out here if I'm going to be the father of a great nation. So they concocted this scheme to allow Hagar to have a child with Abraham. And that's where Ishmael came from. And of course, that's where the nation of Islam came from, eventually. So that's why he's also considered the father of the Muslims, because they came from Ishmael. But what God tells him at this point that no, well, let me back up a second. He also, as part of this, he does fulfill his promise to bless Ishmael as well, and he does, and makes of him a great nation, which he does. The Arab nations came from him. But he makes it clear here in chapter 17 that no, that's not what I meant. You and Sarah are going to have a son, and that's the great nation that I'm going to make of you. So all the other promises sort of were based on that. All of the other promises where he was going to bless the whole world through your descendants, the great nation, the great multitude of people, all of that was going to happen through his son. So that second promise to give them a son was really an outgrowth of the first promise to make of him a great nation, the Abrahamic covenant. But this promise to them had to seem completely absurd. How could Sarah conceive and bear a son at this age? But, of course, God kept that promise, and we're going to come back to that when we get back into Hebrews in a minute. But now I want to look at the third promise that God makes. Well, first of all, it starts as God making an order, a command to him. But a promise comes out of it. And this is the third place where Hebrews focuses. And that's what God says to Abraham in Genesis chapter 22. After all of that God promised them a son and then delivers the son, Isaac. Then God says in Genesis 22:2, now take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Now this last command clearly was the hardest. And it seems to be the one that contradicted everything that God had told him before and promised him before, and seemed to be the one that would be the most difficult for him to fulfill. This is what I was leading up to in the introduction when I said that the life of Abraham is an example of growing faith, and an example where God has asked him to do something at this point in his life where he could not have asked him to do earlier in his life. And not just because before Isaac was born, but I think even Abraham's faith was not, I don't believe, strong enough earlier in his life, back in the chapter 12 era. And you got to understand, decades have passed. We've covered decades of Abraham's life at this point. God asked of him something here in Genesis 22 that he could not have asked him in Genesis 12. I don't think he could have handled it. I don't think he could have accepted it. I don't think he could have believed God to that extent. But at this point, he'd been through so much. God had taken him through so many things. He had fulfilled all of his promises so many times, and he had been there for Abraham and Sarah so many times, that this was a time that, even though it would not have made sense for him to believe God, God had proved himself to him, and he did believe God. So just think about all of the things that he had to believe in order to believe God here. Just kind of going through the bullet points again to remind ourselves where he's come. God had promised an aged Abraham and Sarah that they would have a son. That itself was a promise that they could have never imagined it could happen. So much so that, as I said, they thought they had to help God out by Abraham being with Hagar. Yet God kept and fulfilled that promise, and Isaac was born in chapter 21. God had promised before, through the covenant, and he repeated this and confirmed it numerous times, that a great nation would be born out of Abraham, and it would be through his and Sarah's son. Now here was Isaac, but at this point Isaac had not gotten married yet and had a son of his own. So he did not have a chance yet to have any descendants of his own. And now God was expecting Abraham to sacrifice him by burnt offerings. How could God possibly keep his covenant if Abraham's one and only legitimate son was dead? Also within the command was God's recognition that Isaac was Abraham's beloved son. He even pointed that out. Not only is he your only son, Isaac, but he's the son that you love. And yet he was saying, give him up to me. Such an outcome would be not only to seem to contradict God's promises in the covenant, but would be emotionally devastating to both he and Sarah to give up the one and only son that they have. Why would God do this? What possible motivation? What possible purpose? How could God fulfill all of his other promises, not the least of which was the promise that he would bless him, which implies joy and happiness, with Isaac dead, and dead by Abraham's own hand? How could he possibly do that? Well, that's what brings us then to Hebrews chapter 11 and Abraham's faith. And so we're going to see in these passages in Hebrews 11, 8 through 10, and then verses 17 through 19, we're going to see how Abraham believed God. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, he obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. So here we're talking, the author of Hebrews is commenting on what occurred in Genesis 12:1. God called Abraham to leave his home and take everything he had and go to this unknown place. But what this call was going to do was serve a great purpose in God's plan of redemption, and would be the avenue by which Abraham would be the heir of great blessings and promises for himself, for his family, for his descendants, and ultimately for us as even New Testament Christians. And he obeyed and went even though he did not know where he was going. So he calls this an act of obedience, just like he has mentioned before, but he turns that on its head, showing that was in fact a demonstration of faith and trust in God. Just like Noah moved based on things not seen, Abraham also left his home and set out on this great journey to a place completely unknown to him. And he was going to face challenges and decisions that he could not predict. And just like the whole definition of faith from verse 1 being certain of things we don't see, likewise he obeyed and went even though he could not see where he was going. Not just the physical place, but the whole journey that he would be on. And so his faith needed to grow, but in this first step was a big step, but it was still a step he could take. He says, at this point, Abraham, all I'm asking is for you to go. Now, again, as we will get to it, he ultimately asked the ultimate sacrifice from Abraham. But the first step was just to get up and go. So that was one step he could make at that point in his life. And sometimes that's all God asks us to do in the beginning. A lot of times we're afraid to know what God wants us to do because we're afraid what He'll ultimately ask us to do. And He might ultimately ask us to really trust Him in something great. But usually in the beginning, it's just get up and go. You don't have to see the end. Just know that this is the journey I'm calling you on. So step one is just to get up and go. And at that point, even though he he struggled in a lot of other areas as time went on. In that first step, he said, okay, I'll get up and go. And he did. And so by faith, Abraham was called to the place, and he went. So when we think about what God calls us to do in our lives, and we might be afraid of where he might want us to go, remember that he only asks of us that first step. Just get up and go. And then I'll take care of the rest. And as we're able, as our faith builds, as that muscle strengthens, then he asks a little bit more of us as he takes us on that journey. And then eventually he may ask us to do something that we couldn't have done here, because he builds that faith through fulfilling his promises to us. So I think that's a good stopping point, is just recognizing that in step one, Abraham obeyed, and he got up and went.